Hello, good afternoon, and welcome back to the Tech23 Impact Circles. And for those new to the circles, welcome. Thank you all for joining us today for what's sure to be a day of great food for thought on why corporations need startups to innovate. As is custom, I would first like to acknowledge both the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and the Bunwurrung and Woiwurrung Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land where the Slatterys team works, meets and creates. We pay our respects to elders both past, present and emerging. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Now, today's conversation will be led by Tristan Forbes and is enriched by Gregor, Gimmy, Phil Morle, Georgina North, James Stewart, and Charmaine Tham. I'd like to make a special shout out today to the Tech23 sponsors, Transport for New South Wales, Main Sequence CSIRO Innovation Fund, Oz Industry Entrepreneurs Program, delivered in partnership with I4 Connect, Addison's, ASX, ANSTO, Curtin University, Cicada Innovations, and Evoke AG for making Tech23 happen. So nice to see you here, Rachel.
Oh, thank you, Adina, and hello, everyone. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome everyone who's joining us today, and especially our contributors who are helping to make this Tech23 happen, and to all the contributors who are helping along the way. Thank you all to all of you for zooming in to be part of today. Please say hello and introduce yourselves in the chat. And you are welcome to ask any questions there as well. The link to Slattery's charter will be found in the chat, and that's a guide to the behaviour that Team Slats encourages at all of our events. There are lots more Tech23 circles planned for 21, and many more recordings from all the circles that we did last year. So please watch them yourselves and share and amplify them to all of those in your networks. Please note that today's circle is going to be recorded. Just confirming that we're going to eavesdrop on this conversation and then move to Q&A. Afterwards, you are welcome to stay on the line and connect with others. I'm honoured and grateful to welcome Tristan to kick things off. I want to first thank James, who was the instigator of this circle. If you've got ideas for circles, please direct message or email me or Adina or one of the team. And Tristan, thanks so much. I'm looking forward to this wonderful conversation.
Great, thanks, Rachel. It's great to see everybody here. Thanks for joining us for the conversation. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Tristan Forbes, and for the last couple of years, I've been the Managing Director of Civic Labs for Launch Vic, which was attempting to increase the rates of collaboration between Victorian government departments and startups. And so this whole conversation is something that's of great interest to me, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what the contributors have to say. So the Tech23 team have pulled an amazing bunch of people together for this chat. I'll just give you a very brief introduction to who they are, and then we'll kick off the conversation. So first up, we have James Stewart. James, as we know, has been a coach, mentor and investor in a lot of startups, and he knows firsthand the challenges of attracting corporates to work with them. He has also been doing a bit of reading and has some statistics to share with us regarding the state of play in Australia. So looking forward to that. We're also very lucky to have Gregor Gimmy here from Bavaria in Germany. Gregor has been a mover and shaker over there, and he's sort of evolving the corporate venture capital model into what he calls venture client model. And he's going to share some of the successes he's had with BMW. And we have also, we need to understand what's going on in the Australian market, and Charmaine Tham is here from BCG. So Charmaine has been a lead project lead for BCG, and she's worked on many digital transformation projects across lots of different industries. She's also been involved in corporate innovation ventures, and so we're hoping that Charmaine can give us a pulse of what innovation means inside Australian companies, and how we can perhaps tap into their appetite for startups. When we're talking about success stories, we have Phil Morle here from Main Sequence, who's going to be able to share with us their exciting science venture model. And to tap that off, we have Georgina North from Laing with us. and Laing O'Rourke have worked with Main Sequence on one of their ventures. So Georgina is going to be able to talk to that, as well as other collaborations. Site hire is another one, and give us an insight into the mindset and the culture of organisations that are willing to work in this more collaborative way with the startup sector. So looking forward to that. All right, I'm going to kick things off now for this informal chat with you, James. You've been reading the ASX Thriving Through Innovation report, I understand, and shaking your head a lot.
Yes, very well put. Very well put. So, and it was one of the, thank you, Tristan, for that lovely intro, and thank you, Slatterys, for the very kind invitation. It's a great honour to be on a panel with such an amazing bunch of people. And thank you, everybody who's come along. This is a critically important topic, and I would suggest that the CSIRO report that really kicked off the idea of this panel topic in particular really floored me with a topic that, with a statistic that I think hasn't sadly surprised a lot of people, but it did crystallize it in a very succinct way, which was this stat. Less than half of the ASX top 200 companies had launched any new product or service in the previous 3 years. And the report went into break down sort of why that was and some of the elements about successful innovation at corporates. And I was so shocked by this, I went and found the original report that the soundbite came from and read the whole thing. It took me a few goes because it's quite long. It was really quite shocking. Started talking to people about it, and no one was very surprised by this. That is, on the one hand, deeply troubling for those of us who care about the startup ecosystem, Australia's competitiveness internationally, productivity and rising living standards, and solving all the problems that face us in light of things like climate change and diversity and inclusion in society. Startups are a fundamental part of that. And if the corporate sector is, in effect, closed off from launching new products and services, it's really hard to see how we can make significant progress on all those important topics. Yeah. So yeah, that's why really this one set off alarm bells. I pinged Rachel, and she very kindly pulled this panel together to raise awareness and start a discussion. I would also suggest that flipping the thinking a little bit on that one, that is the level of opportunity that is sitting untapped in Australia's economy at the moment. That is a huge opportunity for startups and for corporates and for society to really get that changed, and moving the needle on those sorts of statistics should be really, I think, a national imperative, because there's so much to be gained.
Well, what are you seeing, Charmaine, in the work that BCG is doing with many of our corporates in Australia? Does it support the findings in the report?
Well, generally speaking, when you're thinking about big corporates, and they're not really incentivized to innovate, right? Because they've worked out how to make money. They've been doing this for decades. Unless there's a serious threat in the industry, like a Netflix has come along and taken away basically all viewing eyes, there's no real drive for them to be able to do it. And for them as well, to think about innovating and coming up with new products and services, it's in essence a little bit of a threat to their own core business model. Because at the end of the day, when you do that, you don't know what the outcome of that new product's going to be, and you don't want to kill the golden goose at the same time. And so I think corporates are in a bit of a funny position unless they see it imminently along the horizon. So in saying that, though, a lot of the companies that we do work with, but like just even observations in newspapers and stuff, they do recognize there is a need for innovation. The question is about when and how they do it. So with certain organizations that see, I think, disruption at the forefront, for example, with the buy now, pay laters coming in, all the banks suddenly get their act together and it's done. COVID happens, bang, all the pharma companies come up with a COVID vaccine within a year. So it can be done, but it's more about, I think, that pressure that gets put on them.
Do you think that they just find it too hard? Is it, if there was a model available that other companies had success with, do you think that would make a difference?
I think it's hard to navigate it within the organization. In a big organization, as you know, there's lots of priorities happening. Prioritization is an issue, and it's difficult, I think, for people with pet projects to really like raise their hands and try to get visibility. How a lot of big corporates have tried to overcome this is to set up a separate venture arm. So that's quite common. So like Westpac, for example, has a very good one, but most large organizations have something of that sort. to try to foster that at least.
Yeah. So Gregor, what do you think was the motivation for BMW to engage with the startup sector?
Well, startups can do stuff that BMW cannot do. That's a gist of it. And that's not only true for BMW, it's also true for Apple. It's true for Google. It's true for Bosch. And that's really the nature of a startup. Because if you start a company, you know, the basic question you ask yourself as an entrepreneur is, why am I starting this company? What can I do that others can't? Now, if you go into the startup ecosystem, meaning now you start discussing with investors, venture capitalists, the good ones, the very first question they will ask you is, what do you do that BMW cannot do? Because if you don't have a clear answer to that, you won't get any money from me, correct? Because the nature of the business is that. And then you have to have a proof. And this is really what ultimately makes BMW really and Apple to work, also speak with startups, is you as a startup need to have IP that cannot easily be copied by the corporate. So with that IP, you can transform that into a solution that's really important to the corporate. And that's really bottom line why a BMW engages with startups and needs startups. There would be no autonomous driving without startups. There would be no electric mobility without startups, as an example.
Yeah, very true. But what about the appetite? Because, you know, in Australia, I feel like there has to be this burning bridge, like Charmaine was saying. But I mean, I was over in Europe a couple of years ago, and a BMW, I don't know that there's a burning bridge there, but I do know that like Airbus and SAP and even Deutsche Bank, they have offices all over the world scouting for the world's best startups. It seems to me that they've got an appetite for this more so than Australia.
Well, I can't speak to what's happening in Australia in that sense, and why this is not happening in Australia. I can say that in general, you know, I think the only really ecosystem that has a substantial appetite and understanding of the strategic value of startups is Silicon Valley. And that's the corporates of Silicon Valley. So I'm talking about HP, I'm talking about Intel, I'm talking about Apple, Google, Cisco, and all the plus 50,000, employee companies that are located in Silicon Valley. The C-levels, the boards, there are a few exceptions outside Silicon Valley, and maybe one of them is BMW, where there's a real true understanding of two basic facts. First of all, startups have IP I do not have. And whether it's IP to innovate a product or a logistics process or a manufacturing process, and they have money I don't have, correct? That's a very important fact that, they have, it's a very clear number, somewhere around the factor, at one point I calculated BMW for its typical artificial intelligence challenge, project, problem we had at BMW. A good startup would have up to 30 times more budget than a BMW department for that. So those two facts is really what drives the understanding of the value of that resource. Because if your understanding of the value of the resource is that a startup is lean and I'm not, then you're not going to work with startups. Because you're the CEO of the company and you're responsible for making this company lean, or maybe BCG is, helping you with making it lean, correct? But this can't be the ultimate argument. The ultimate argument is they have IP I do not have, I cannot copy. They have money I do not have and I cannot access for a specific problem, because a corporate has thousands of problems. A startup is trying to solve one problem. And for each problem one startup is solving, there are at least 50 other startups who are trying to solve the exact same problem. So if you look, for example, at the problem of autonomous driving, we're looking at least $5 to $10 billion in venture capital that's flowing into those startups. And those are billions that the corporates do not get. Right? They don't have that money. They don't have access to venture capital. Right?
Yeah.
And this is really what needs to get into the heads. And I think if you start arguing with facts and those types of hard arguments instead of soft arguments, then I think this is what starts a mind shift potentially also in corporates in Australia.
Well, this would be a good time to bring you into the conversation, Georgina. How did these decisions get made at Laing O'Rourke to become involved?
Yeah, great question. So I work in the dedicated technology and innovation group. So we're a private company with shareholders, two shareholders, the O'Rourkes, who are dedicated to innovation. So we had our own fund that is a mix of internal consultancy, future-proofing the business, looking at what's out there in other industries, in construction tech, and working out how we bring that in. And equally, how do we attract talent, subject matter experts, roboticists, multidisciplinary engineers to develop new products? So that's been our remit for the last 10 years. The magic in the source is to keep that innovation team separate, but really strategically aligned, and then being able to use the core business to test your ideas.
Fantastic. And why is it that they don't wait for the burning bridge, you know, that other Australian corporates are known for?
You need some really passionate people that are heading the innovation department. You know, this idea that disruption is coming. We've seen it happen in construction anyway. We've seen it happen in mining and agriculture and these big industries around us. It's the people that are banging on the door saying technology and disruption, we need to listen to it and you need to be ready for it. So yeah, it's really down to individuals that are really driving that vision.
I think it's really interesting what you were saying, Gregor, about having access to that capital. And I know that you're moving away, your approach moves away from CVC and more into the venture client model. And I think this is where Main Sequence in Australia is making a massive difference, Phil, in terms of being able to bring some capital to some of this innovation to get it happening.
Well, I was just listening to Gregor then and thinking there's definitely a maturity piece at play here, because I think most Australian corporates think startups don't have any money, and the reason that they're reaching out is to get some money from them. And it's been one of our insights that's actually the dynamic that immediately kills a collaboration opportunity between a startup and a big company, because the first job to be done is to convince a whole bunch of people to give the startup some money. And I'm not talking about procurement here. I'm saying, hey, you know, I've got this great opportunity. Why don't you fund my company and be a strategic investor? And first of all, those processes take a long time. They take more than a year. You know, startups are dead by the time that happens. They're usually pretty soul destroying. They're not about trying to build up an opportunity. They're about trying to figure out what's going to go wrong. And of course, everything's going to go wrong, because that's where they're up to. And so, you know, our model's been about how do we really unlock the what we believe to be the truly valuable gift that corporates can bring to a startup, which is access to customers, insight, supply chain. And that's been particularly powerful for us, because many of our companies are industrial companies, or they're making hardware. They're not. So it's a very different proposition to bringing a digital company to News Corp or something like that. We need shipping. We need factories. We need optical systems. We need labs. And we need and those things are in big companies. And so the way we structure we call it our venture science model. And we found companies with a founder group that we think that we say these are the only, it needs all these people together. There's no way this company can exist without all of them. And that always includes what we call an industry founder. And we never ask that industry founder for money. It's all about what can you do and how can you deliver advantage. And then if you do deliver that advantage, you know, you end up being a, let's say, 25% shareholder in the company. But you haven't had to go through that process, back to where we began this, of trying to convince your board or your senior leadership to allocate $2 million in something that's absolutely brand new and not proven yet. That's all, basically the proposition is, let's go on a journey, let's do everything we can and deliver the company that we can invest in next. And so, and we found that just works terrifically well. And honestly, I'm so glad, because I think I've dedicated my career to the very strong belief that the stuff that's in a startup and the stuff that's in a corporate combined together is the most powerful thing possible. And it's great to see it working.
So Charmaine, do you think that corporate Australia understands that startups aren't really necessarily looking for their money? How do you reckon that message would land if it was more widely known?
That's a good question, actually. I do unfortunately agree. I think that is a perception that does happen quite a lot, mainly because a lot of startups do end up in that conversation with the big corporates. So they need to do something, I guess, to reframe the conversation, like what fills it. Like, because I fully agree that I think the collaboration between a startup and a corporate, and like they bring different things to the table, right? And how you manage to, I think, find a way to work together really is key, but that's not always a straightforward thing to build. And I mean, with corporations as well, it's not like they don't innovate at all. They do innovate. It's just quite incremental. They usually innovate on their core product rather than come up with some completely new idea or completely new product. So you do need to make your case, I think, quite compelling. But I do think the startups in Australia probably need to shift away from that as well. I don't think it's very clear to the corporates.
So Gregor, from reading a little bit about the work you're doing with BMW, they have a selection process where they only take startups that have been through programs or that have got capital. Is that right?
Yeah, so this is part of our venture client model. So what we mean by venture client is that a corporate buys a startup product and not startup equity. So they provide money, but not capital, but revenue. And so that's a very important, let's say, basic principle that I see, is that the role of the corporate is not to be the investor. The role of the corporate is really to be the user of a startup technology, because that's what ultimately makes a startup and an economy work. I mean, Silicon Valley works not because of the venture capitalists, but because of their venture clients. The venture capitalists come as a next step, correct? Because now, when an HP or when an Intel or when a Cisco, you know, starts buying from startups so that the startups can go public, or they acquire the whole startup company, now here a lot of wealth is created that then flows back in form of investment companies. So there are many, you probably won't find any VC in Silicon Valley that doesn't have, you know, at least one or two early Google employees who've become really rich from a Google IPO, correct? So you see, so that's very important. So the venture client model really focuses on that and says, look, our best contribution to the startup ecosystem is to be a client, because that's what the startup is founded for. You know, I want to help clients. I want to help a corporate with my technology. And that's why VCs invest, because they say, hey, you have a value proposition for your clients. You're solving a big problem. Now, when corporates get into investing, now they're changing the role, correct? And they're not, and you also generate a conflict, right? For example, you start negotiating with another VC. around who's getting what shares and who's getting what price for the shares and who's getting what rights, because a corporate is always biased by the strategic objective together with the financial objective. And this is what makes the whole thing really sputter. And I know that a whole industry, including Boston Consulting, including McKinsey, is praying to the CEOs of corporates to set up corporate venture capital funds. And my data and my experience within many corporates, not just BMW, also Siemens, Porsche, and so on, is that this is really the wrong approach, because the best way for you as a corporate to gain a strategic benefit from a startup is to just use the startup technology, either by buying the product or by buying the startup, not by investing in the startup, right? So, and one of the important, and that goes back to your initial thing, is now obviously you want to select the best startups. And one critical element, and this is what makes this innovation ecosystem so powerful for corporates, is that you have the venture capital community. The venture capital community serves as a filter for the best ideas, for the best, innovators, and it also serves as a de-risk methodology really of an innovation, because the venture capitalist puts in money that you don't have to put in at a very early stage of the innovation process. And this is very powerful, and this is what makes startups such an attractive innovation engine for corporates, because you don't have to put in the initial 50,000, 500,000 or 50 million to reach a level of innovation that that makes it very attractive. And another last point, there is about 5 million startups out there, out of which somewhere around 50 to 100,000 are venture backed. Correct. So if you look at startups, and if you're a corporate or whoever, you will always find a huge amount of startups asking for capital.
So,
but you shouldn't be biased by that. You should be looking at the ones that are venture backed and leave the selection. Who of those, what % of startups do really have a solution that is, relevant for me? You should use and leverage the work of venture capitalists as basically free innovation management and free innovation early financing, and disregard really the ones. You can obviously send your corporate money into LP as an LP, correct? You should give money to venture capitalists. You should give money to Phil. Obviously, you should, just like you're giving money to universities. Yeah, that's very important. You give, big corporates are giving a lot of money to universities for research grants, correct? So they should give money to VCs, because they are the best in selecting, and they have the most efficient process, and there is zero conflict. And instead of, it's like if BMW would start setting up engineering universities, you don't do that either, correct? So why should you set up? So I think, and here's where really this dynamics gets to work, and that works very nicely in, for example, Apple doesn't have a CVC fund. They don't, zero, zip. But they acquire one company per month.
Fascinating. Were you going to say something then, Phil?
Yeah, I think this is very insightful, because what you can see here is the interplay between venture capital and corporates. And it goes to my earlier maturity point. I think we haven't had enough venture capital here, so there hasn't been enough money. So people have gone to corporates to try and fund their company. Companies haven't been mature enough. The corporate hasn't had a great experience. And we've had a vicious circle. You're describing a virtuous circle. I think similarly, venture capital is optimized for knowing what to do when there's very little evidence, and how to deploy that risk capital to de-risk it. Companies aren't really good at that. But I don't know if anyone's tried to sell something to a car company like BMW, but actually if you do have a company that's trying to sell to a car company, I can tell you it's pretty much impossible. It takes years and years and years, and very, very just such intricate industry knowledge and network building and Rolodex. So I think for Gregor's program to open up BMW to startups, that is just such a gift. And then if a venture capitalist looks at a startup that's got to deal with BMW, they're very, very interested. So this whole thing's starting to work very well. I'd also just there was an earlier question about, there's a similar problem to relating to corporates as going to work with research organizations. And that's right as well. Like the capital piece is, can be a real glue between all of them to get it unlocked. And our first venture science adventure was with V2 Food. And we did that because it was all around capital. If you look at Impossible Foods in the US, it had raised $500 million and before the first customer got to try the product. Now that's a very difficult company to fund if you're in a big company, and if you're in CSIRO or something, you can't get that from grant funding. But venture capital likes that, as long as they can see, as long as we can see the path to the really big thing. So it really needs this interplay between the money, the customers, and the supply chain, which is the corporate piece, and the innovation engine. It needs these three things working together in harmony. And maybe that's something that's dawning here in Australia now, that we should just be mindful of and unlock it.
That would be so exciting if it was. But James, we need to come back to the reality for a lot of Australian startups. And, like often to get VC attention, you have to have a first customer, you have to have some kind of pilot, a proof of concept. What's your experience? We all know how tough that can be for Aussie startups.
Well, absolutely. And I think, being fair to our VC friends, they have a job to do, which is to generate returns for their limited partners. They have impact goals, and Phil and the May Sequence team, I think, are doing a phenomenal job of not just making a lot of money for LPs, but also delivering massive impact and moving commercialization and research into the market for real. So, we've got to be fair to them. They have a job to do. And one of the biggest things I spend my time in the evenings and weekends talking to startup founders about is actually trying to explain to them what VCs do and how they do it and why, so that they can actually go and have those conversations in a way that's successful. Because if they don't understand the venture capital model at all, which is actually something that Phil helped me understand a lot a few years back, if they don't have that understanding, then they'll approach things in the wrong way. And in a similar basis, as someone who has been in corporate and in startups, if you go and approach corporate and you're not speaking the corporate's language and you don't understand the other counterparty, how can you negotiate in a way that's productive for both parties? So it then requires the corporate to be very, very experienced and very aware of the startup dynamic in order for them to engage. So in the end, what you really want, I think, is for all of the parties to be experienced with the other parties in that ecosystem, in that journey. But as much as possible, when the startup's turning up, I have met some startup founders where they have got a very, very compelling story. They have massive advantages, and they understand what their advantages are compared to the people that they're sitting and having a discussion with in corporate or in VC. And they really understand what value they can bring to that dynamic, and they are free to act in a way and with a speed and a pace that is just not matched by the corporate or any innovation team that's trying to spin up their own version. So it's a case of horses for courses and taking the right approach, and everybody understanding what their comparative advantage is in the dynamic and really working on that basis. Then I think you get really good value creation. So
should Australia, is there enough VC money here for Australian startups to thrive? No. or should they be there's enough corporate interest here as well, or a lot of Australian startups go overseas? Georgina? Oh, sorry, just a sec, James.
Yeah, look, I guess it depends on the industry, right? So you look at fintech, huge amount of investment globally and in Australia. Depends on the specific company as well. Do they have an innovation arm? Do they have a problem that they need solving? Have they engaged someone to solve it? I think Australia is catching up with the appetite for innovation, and it's only helped by, I guess, agendas that are coming out in kind of policy and government to support innovation in Australia.
Yeah, that's a great point. But we still need more corporates that are going to answer the door when the doorbell rings from a startup. So it'd be really interesting. Have you got any tips, Charmaine, as to what you think might get their attention?
Having very good networks tend to help a lot. But like what Georgina said earlier, I think it was you, Georgina, that it was really important to have, I think, the one person in the organization who will champion you. And that person needs to have a lot of influence at the senior level as well. So if you can't find that person, it will be very difficult to have that conversation. And then the second part is to make sure that your pitch has to be very clean, right? You need to have you need to support it with evidence as well. I've been in conversations, well, this is not at BCG, but I've been in conversations where, you pitch something and they'll literally ask you, can we see it? Because the thing with startups is sometimes like startups tend to talk a lot about something that they have or may have, but they don't actually have it yet. So making sure that you have the proof and evidence to support your pitch and the goods to show for it, I think that makes a huge difference.
If I can add something to that, I think that's so spot on. I mean, if as corporates begin to understand the language of startups, they then learn to ask the right questions. So from our side as a corporate, we have a pretty set criteria. When you're in a pitch, we know what to look for. Is there strategic fit? Are they solving a real problem? Do they have any customers? Does their thing actually work? And is it a team that, we want to work with? And that's basically what will get you through the door and into our pipeline. And that can spark a whole bunch of different things, different routes.
Interesting. I know from my work with Victorian government that they actually don't know what's out there. So they're trying to solve all these problems and create better services for citizens. And they're trying to do it in really old ways with clunky tools and, queues instead of online portals. They don't actually even know the power of what is in the startup sector and how transformational it can be. I wonder if that's also an issue.
Yeah, I reckon. And if I can speak for Laing O'Rourke, part of my team's remit is to keep that eye out on the external environment. You need one eye looking out and one eye looking in, and trying to find that the matchmaking between the two.
Yeah, that's great.
Maybe from my side, a short recommendation to startups: check out some of the publications of Silicon Valley venture capitalists. Like I just posted a video from a partner of Andreessen Horowitz. They're extremely good in coaching and enabling their startups to sell to corporates. And they certainly do not complain about not invented here syndromes, or they're not complaining about governments not doing enough for corporates or startups or what have you. They just go to their startups and say, hey, you got to show them a strong value proposition. You're going to show them a return on investment. Tell the corporate how much money you're saving by buying my technology. And if you don't have clear numbers here, then you won't sell. If you don't have a clear sales process, you won't sell. And this is so I think it's a very interesting place to learn. Is just going online and looking at some of those videos, or some of those. Also, the startup, the Y Combinator is very good videos on how to sell to corporates or to individuals. Doesn't really matter. This is really essential, and there's some good content out there.
Sorry, Gregor, just to follow up on the policy side of things. In Australia, we have accelerating commercialisation and organisations like that will match funding when a startup finds an investor. Do you think that there's an opportunity if instead they found a customer? How does that work in your region?
Well, that's what I'm working on. Is that the government would probably generate a higher impact on the economy if they would look at the demand side, not the supply side. So if they would basically let's say a corporate issues a purchase order of $1 million to a startup, how about if they would then, subsidize that purchase? So they basically incentivize the purchase from startups based upon the on the fact that generally a startup technology is better. So basically you're subsidizing buying more modern technology as opposed to buying old technology. Obviously, I would only do that from a government point of view if I'm sure that the corporate knows what a startup is.
Mm-hmm.
This corporate knows to select a good from a bad startup. It's kind of like you're not subsidizing the building of a factory if the corporate doesn't have a guy who knows how to build factories, correct? So why should you subsidize and help a corporate to buy from startups if there's nobody in the corporate, if there's no department, if there's no competency within the corporate that knows how to deal with a startup, that knows how to do a technology transfer, that knows how to integrate startup technology and so forth. And that's what we just got news from one European government. It's a regional government, and I can't say the name because it's still not public, but they decided to subsidize the creation of a venture client unit or capability at corporates. So whatever money those corporates are spending on training a team in the venture client processes, on buying resources so that this corporate can select, identify, assess, evaluate startups, they are subsidizing this cost because they see that this will increase demand for startup technology, which will then have a positive impact on the competitiveness of that corporate and would then also have an impact on the startup ecosystem, because startups will have faster access to clients and through that grow faster.
So what do you think about that, Georgina and Charmaine, in terms of, I mean, we have an R&D tax incentive, but do you think that would make a difference to how companies innovate if there was a matched funding from another program like that?
Look, I think it's great for startups to be able to, I guess, if their first route is to attract a customer and that can then help with investment, often I think I saw a comment in the chat, and I 100% agree that when you have purchase orders from customers, that's something that investors look for. So it's about chicken and egg there. Do you need the money or the customer first? And anything that can help start that cycle going is going to be a benefit.
And from my end, like, I think all the startups are actually looking right out there. It's more about the degree to which they make an effort, I guess. And having the R&D tax, their incentive, I think certainly has played a role, especially in certain industries where it's research heavy, like in the pharmaceutical industry, which I was a part of for a while as well. So I think that certainly it is, but it's just quite immature and quite small in Australia, is my sense.
Right. Phil, I think you were going to add something there.
I was thinking back to Gregor's discussion a little bit and thinking that a lot of this is about mindset as well, and how to get a large risk-averse organization to take a chance with something that might not be quite ready yet. Like in BMW, Gregor, how early do you go? Like, how much risk with immaturity will BMW take? And do you need to do work with the organization to help them know how to see, how to decide?
Well, yes, definitely. And so what I saw at BMW is that it's not, we can't improve our relationship with startups by saying we need to be better with startups. What we need is a startup department that has a specific operational model that's geared towards startups. It's kind of like saying we need computers and we need software, but we don't have an IT department. That won't work, correct? If you're a 50,000 person company and you know that you're dependent on computers and on software, it wouldn't work without an IT department. You can't just ask your friend, go out and buy some computers, correct? So that's why
but even if, let's say I'm a startup and I've created a new computer vision technology that I think you guys should use for your driverless cars that you're building. Yeah. I assume even with the best startup team in the world, there's still an interfacing to do before actually it's going to be looked at seriously.
Sure, but it makes a huge difference. So to give you some data, for the BMW Startup Garage, which is that startup department at BMW, BMW piloted maybe around 1 startup per year. So we've increased that by a factor of more than 10. So we're looking at 30 to 50 per year now.
That's just
Before
fantastic.
the BMW Startup Garage, before the department, it took BMW 2.1 years to issue a purchase order to a startup. It now takes about 3 weeks.
Fantastic.
Wow.
Correct. So imagine a company as big as BMW without an HR department. How long would it take your students to get a job at that corporate? They're sending the resume in to, I don't know, 50 people, and nobody knows, is that a good resume? Is it a bad resume? Is grade A better than grade B? Is the university, is the pay they are demanding, what they're the contract? So it would basically stop your recruiting capabilities. So the same thing happens with this type of department. You need that department, and it needs a good process. The process needs to be basically lowering those barriers, legal barriers, purchasing barriers. You need to have a different evaluation system. You cannot evaluate a startup technology like you would evaluate an IBM technology. And here's where we go in and set basically the standard. So one thing we did at BMW first, we said, we are buying even a prototype and call it a finished product. That's a big innovation. So before, BMW just looked at, a startup came and said, oh, we have a great solution. So show me your solution. Well, I have a prototype. Well, this is not a solution. It's not certified. It's not scalable. It's not this. I can buy it. Correct? This is where the story ended. Now, I said in this startup, in this venture client model system that I set up, I said, I don't care if it's a certified product or not. As long as I can put it into a car and see it work, that's good enough. I don't have to buy 1 million units. I can buy 10 units. And this is some of the changes that we did that enables BMW to work with extremely early stage startups many years before they even bring their own products to market. And I just posted a video from one of those companies out of Israel. You can see a video here where a startup, started to interact, and this is very important.
So I just want to sort of drill into this just a little bit, because I think it's really important, because this is very distinct from what I see happening in Australia. What I just heard you say is that there is a habit now at BMW with this specialist team to buy sort of pilot scale products from startups so that they can try them out and sort of see how that works in their company. Now, this is really interesting, because what I think happens in Australia is that the corporates still want it to be free, and they want it to be heavily thought out in that sort of free sort of universe before they make a really, really big decision to become a multi-million-dollar customer. And I think that's an unlock which you've just described, which I think we should all pursue and try and do more of. And I really hope corporates will try and do it. And that's how I can see how you could do, 1,000 startup contracts in a year. And, let's just try all these things. And then how smart the company that BMW becomes then, because it's tried everything and it knows how it works in its cars and what value it adds. I think there's a lot to do here in Australia with that.
It's fascinating. So Gregor, your company 27 Pilots works with different corporates, doesn't it? It doesn't just work with BMW, and it feels like that there needs to be this sort of middle ground before corporates develop that capability themselves. They may need someone like a 27 Pilots style organization to help them.
Yes, so that's why I decided to leave BMW, is to help other corporates set up such venture client capabilities and departments. So basically help them implement those processes and help implement the tools they need to train their people, to change internal purchasing processes, to change cultural mindset regarding startups. And so basically I applied my learnings I had at BMW at several other large corporations, everything from Holcim, which is the world's largest cement manufacturer, to Bosch, Siemens, which are also very high tech. and it all works. The venture client really works greatly at all those corporations. So I've seen really similar results as I saw at BMW in terms of not committing that mistake that Phil just mentioned. You know, you should not go to a startup and say, and you should always think about small pilot purchases. And that's, by the way, what every company does anyway, correct? If IBM would approach you or Microsoft and say, I have a very innovative solution for, I don't know, whatever, correct? No corporate would go there and say, here, Microsoft, here's 50 million, please install this across the overall corporation. They would also start with a pilot. But they would obviously pay for that pilot, correct? Because Microsoft wouldn't do that for free. Nobody would do that for free. So what you need to do is you need to change that, and you need to say, hey, just because it's a startup, you shouldn't demand being free. You should demand that the startup is unique. Show me what you can do that Microsoft cannot do. And this is what this department is about. The process is always geared towards, what can the startup do that I cannot do myself at BMW or Bosch or at Siemens? And what can the startup do that none of my other suppliers can do? And if you do not have a clear proof that the startup is unique, then you don't get him into the system. That's an extreme important, because it's not a sales department for startups. It's a department that searches for solutions from the startup ecosystem where there are no other solutions and other ecosystems out there. And this is what really gets this whole thing going.
So,
sorry, I just have a question while Gregor is on that trail. In terms of pricing for these prototypes and these pilots, what's the strategy that you seem have worked best? Like, is it like a pricing at cost, a pricing at a profit, or like a real price? We'd like to understand that pricing negotiation piece.
Well, first of all, we defined some basic principles on how to get to a price, because every price is different. So we're saying it's a lump sum for every startup. That doesn't work. It would make it a little bit easier, but it's if you define some basic principles. For example, one principle is we buy the prototype or we rent the prototype, correct? Mm-hmm. Another principle is you do not pay for development, you only pay for installation, correct? So you wouldn't go to a startup and say, please develop a piece of software that makes your sensor work with our cars. You wouldn't pay for that. This is something the startup has to pay itself, because that would mean that you're generating IP and you're paying for IP, and then you would own this IP, and this would generate a conflict. So generally what we're seeing in terms of pricing, we're seeing that for software, generally those pilots go between 5 to 25,000. If it involves hardware, it tends to be 25 to 50. Sometimes it goes beyond 50,000. Because hardware obviously is a bigger cost, because now the startup has to. So the question to the startup is always, so how much does this prototype cost you? But without calculating any kind of custom development work. Mm-hmm. And then the startup has to basically argue why this prototype costs 50,000, because you're just buying 2 units early stage, as opposed to $5 at a point where you may buy 1 million units in the future once you've seen that this works. And having those rules in place is an important part of our work in enabling those venture client units to purchase for the correct price. That's, for example, in one example we had from an Israeli startup, we had a budget for this early prototype of 240,000. And by applying those principles, we reduced the price to 40,000, but without annoying the startup, correct? We basically said, well, if you want us to pay this and this and this would basically mean that we own the IP. Do you want that? And they said, no. Okay, we're taking it off. Because that's a mistake always sometimes committed by startups, that they think they can put everything on the invoice. And then they complain that the corporate wants to steal the IP, not being aware that what they put in the invoice basically means I'm selling my IP, correct? And here's where the startup department needs to really be the moderator, knowing what's good for the startup, but also knowing what's needed on the corporate side in order to mitigate those types of conflicts.
And this is something that we grappled with a lot at Civic Labs. So we would have the government customer sign an agreement right from the beginning, saying that they're coming into this to help co-develop a solution to a big problem that they have, that they wouldn't own IP, and that was part of the agreement with coming in and figuring out sort of like we had a standard price that sort of kept it quite even across the cohort as opposed to individual. But at times that wasn't working. So there's just so many things that
there's a general
security that we have to go through to be able to figure out how to get these collaboration agreements to work.
Yeah, there's a general rule, and I see this mistake committed several times, and this is also a very important part of this venture client process is you do not use a startup as a consulting firm.
Exactly.
Correct. It's not like it's not a custom development. You always need to work with startups that have a product and have an IP and want to deliver that. If the startup starts offering engineering services, it's not considered a startup. And
what has to be kept in mind as well is that you want the company, the startup company, to develop and be a successful company, because then you have a constant supply of whatever product that it is they're going to supply you with. And there needs to sort of be that understanding with in terms of how the corporate or government interacts with them. Georgina, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just thinking about SiteHive, which is a company that we've partnered with for an IoT environmental monitoring solution. We've done the venture client model with them, compared to I guess another route that we've done, which is Prescient. So I was just reflecting on the intellectual property advantages and challenges, and the speed to market and the speed to value that comes from one or the other. Yeah, really interesting.
Right.
One of the important things why a startup is so relevant to corporates is the IP. And it's the IP being funded by a venture capitalist. So many startups come out of university. Look at, Impossible Foods. Look at, everything that's happening in pharma and biotech. Most of those startups come out of university. They come with a certain amount of IP. And the venture capitalists invest in the startups in order to, obviously at some point, use that IP as a way of bargaining an exit and so on. So the startup ecosystem works because of the ownership of the IP to the startup. Now, if the startup goes into sharing IP or actually developing IP by contract, it's no longer a startup, it's a consulting company.
Right.
And you should call yourself a startup if you're an engineering company. You're a new engineering company and you may be a new enterprise and stuff, but the Silicon Valley kind of startup we're thinking about is always something that has IP, wants to make this IP big in a product, in a use case through venture capital, and then go public or be acquired by a corporate because this IP meets a specific need.
There's another angle I think it was in the chat a few seconds ago, but I just think it's worth dwelling on, and that is speed.
Right.
This is, especially speed is probably the biggest advantage of startups, but we don't have a lot of time in terms of burning cash, and corporates can play a massively long game for very legitimate reasons, but it can take months. And I will say, having taken a number of startups to some of the venture client units actually Gregor and his company has set up, we got to a no within, I think, 4 days, which is good. None of them actually got through, but the startups were very, very relieved. So this notion that in some way by playing a long game with a startup, you're doing something good for them by stringing them along and burning runway for them is absolutely not correct. And so I think it's a very, very important point to bring to this audience, is that actually, if you are in a corporate and you want to work well with startups, quickly getting to a no in the right way is much, much more valuable than getting to a no after months and months of DD and effort and all this kind of stuff, and just playing games with them. Yeah. So important.
Great point. And although it feels like this is a hot conversation that could keep going for ages, we're at time, so we need to wrap up. So maybe just go around to each of the contributors and just ask for a takeaway thought or something they want to ponder or leave behind, or what they're going to do straight after this meeting. Maybe we start. Who would like to start? That's putting you all on the spot. Georgina?
I'll start. Yeah. I think what Gregor and Phil were talking about being able to use the VCs as the litmus test for corporates of where they should be spending their money is excellent. You know, as I come to get to know the VC ecosystem, I'm looking forward to having a chat, Phil.
Yeah, I actually feel like accelerator programs could be added to that list as well, because there's a whole lot of work that has to happen before VC too. So maybe that's another way that it could be thought of as well. Charmaine?
Yeah, I really love the idea of Gregor's, you know, you have to set up a team to actually properly work through the funnel and set up the processes to think about startups properly. Because I think in Australia, well, what I've seen anyway personally from personal experience is you have like accelerator labs, you have VC funding, there's all these different things, but I don't see what Gregor's discussing, which is like basically a little machine within the organization that just filters through all this stuff.
Yeah, great. James?
I have a challenge for the audience. So there are a lot of people on this call, and my challenge to the audience is these tech circles are going on, and there are a lot of friends who are in corporates who probably have never even talked to a startup. And we need to open up their thinking a little bit. So I challenge the audience to bring a corporate friend to the next Tech23, send them the recording for this, ping any of the panelists. But I agree, the reason that I particularly have enjoyed working alongside Gregor and conversations with him is because a lot of what we struggle with in Australia is industry concentration and a lack of competition. So we don't have the driving need coming through at the corporate level. What we have is massive disruption and corporate collapse, which is a really dangerous and heavy way that kicks a lot of people out into the cold all at once. That's a really bad way to run an economy. On the flip side of this, if we actually get the corporates to pick up and habitually form these teams, get involved with the startups, there's a lot of productivity increase, there's a lot of social good, and the sustainable development goals have been mentioned in the chat too. This is how we get to them. This is how we bring new thinking ideas in and interaction in the market and in society. So it's all to play for. Grab your corporate friends, bring them in. If they're not angel investing, send them to talk to the folks who are, and let's get this stuff going, because it's all to play for.
Thanks, James. Brilliant. Gregor, Phil, who's next?
I'll just go quick. I would like to just celebrate how far we've come. 10 years ago, corporates would say we don't need outside help, we can do it all internally. And they don't now, they're very open. I think there's a great openness and I think a sophistication about how most corporates think about things. I think they just don't know what to do, because it is hard. And my takeout from this has been very practical, simple things which we can do with corporates and startups together. And I've learned a lot, even just, you know, as a VC, thinking about how our companies are working with startups. Gregor gave the example of a company that came to them with a $250,000 co-development opportunity, and he ended up doing a $40,000 pilot license with them. And that's an epiphany for me, because that is you haven't even, it's not just the IP problem as such. You haven't even had that discussion, which is what takes a year. And then, you know, to Gregor's point, you end up at the end of that discussion having given away your crown jewels, and it's very difficult from that point. But the second thing is it's much more useful proof for the VC market if you've actually sold $40,000 worth of product, rather than actually got some consulting non-recurring revenue from BMW or another corporate. VCs discount that. So it's much better for a startup to actually get proper paid revenue for actual products with a corporate. And I'm definitely taking that away, and I'm going to look for chances to do it everywhere I can.
Thanks, Phil. Fantastic. Do you have anything you want to leave us with, Gregor? It's been great to have you on the call.
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me, and it's been a pleasure to share my experiences here. And please come back to me, anybody on the panel or from the audience, if you have questions, if you would like to learn more. I just shared the website of the BMW Startup Garage, the Venture Client Unit at BMW. There are others out there, and so happy to share some more experiences here and how this process works. Maybe as a takeaway for everybody on the call, I mean, if companies like Apple, BMW, Bosch, and Siemens, you know, do it,
yep,
this should be maybe an interesting benchmark. And just, you know, if they do it, why don't we do it? Correct. I think this may also be a way of getting the attention of top
and
management.
you know, we have, sorry.
Yeah, and the final thing is, you know, start changing the mindset at corporates is, you know, be a good client, don't try to be a good investor, because it's really what helps you as a corporate is to be a good client, because you're ultimately getting help from a startup as opposed to trying to help a startup. And this is what will, you know, really generate this win-win situation we're all looking for.
Fantastic. We have such an incredible talent of startups in Australia and founders. It has to happen. I feel like as soon as these models start evolving and we have ways that we understand that work that allow collaboration between corporates, governments, and startups, I feel like the next 5 years is going to be really interesting. Thanks, Rachel.
Oh, thanks so much, Tristan, and thank you to all of the contributors. Gregor, thank you so much for joining us from the north. It was just brilliant, and I can see everyone clapping. It's lovely to see so many wonderful influencers, and James's challenge to us all is definitely a great one. It has actually always been a big challenge for Tech23 to get corporates along, so this is why this circle particularly is close to our heart. So thanks, James. Thanks, Phil, of course, again. Gregor, Charmaine, Tristan, Gina, it's really great to have you on. We're going to stop recording now. Thank you to everyone that's actually been on the circle. You're welcome to hang around and have a chat.